I bought an abandoned mansion at auction for $400. While restoring the library, I found a hidden steel door behind the bookshelves. Behind it was more money than I had ever seen in my life, and a single word waiting for me on a shelf. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. My name, for the purposes of this story, is Emma Whitlock. I'm 36 years old, and 3 years ago I was living in a rented studio above a laundromat in Asheville, North Carolina, listening to the dryers thump through the floorboards every night until midnight. I had exactly $312 in my checking account, a storage unit full of furniture I couldn't sell, and a business that no longer existed. For 8 years, I had run an estate sale and antique restoration company with my closest friend from design school, Nora Bellamy. We built it from nothing. 2 folding tables at a flea market, then a storefront, then a client list that included some of the wealthiest families in 3 counties. I did the restoration work. Nora handled contracts and clients. I trusted her with all of it, which was, in hindsight, the first mistake. 18 months before the story starts, Nora dissolved our partnership without telling me until it was already done, quietly moving our contracts into a new LLC under her name alone, keeping the reputation we'd spent 8 years building, and leaving me holding a non-compete her lawyer had drafted 2 weeks before she pulled the plug. I didn't have the money to fight it, so I didn't. My mother told me to move home to Georgia. My younger brother sent me listings for retail management positions with subject lines like "no pressure, but..." I told them both I was fine. I was not fine. I was refinishing other people's furniture for cash under the table and eating cereal for dinner because it didn't require the stove. I found the auction listing the way you find most desperate ideas, at 2 in the morning, scrolling through a county government website I had no business being on. Some counties auction off properties when back taxes go unpaid long enough. Most of what shows up is unremarkable, a vacant lot, a burned-out duplex. But every so often, something appears that scares off every serious bidder. A title complicated by an unresolved estate, structural damage nobody wants to quantify, a history strange enough that even flippers walk away. The listing for 12 Belcross Lane, in a small town called Belhaven, about 90 minutes from Asheville, had all 3. It was described, with almost comical restraint, as a 3-story brick residence, built 1928, requires extensive repair. The photographs showed a mansion, there was no other honest word for it, with a collapsed section of front portico, ivy consuming the east wall up to the second-floor windows, and a chimney leaning at an angle that made my stomach drop just looking at it. The last occupant, a man named Thomas Ashworth, had died in 2015 without a will and without any heir the county could locate. The property had sat in legal limbo for 3 years while the state tried and failed to find a single living relative. The minimum bid was $400. On the morning of the auction, I was the only person who showed up. I drove out to see the house that same afternoon. It was late October, the kind of pale gold afternoon that makes even ruin look romantic, and the oaks lining Belcross Lane had turned the deep rust color that only lasts about 10 days a year. It was the only beautiful thing I could honestly say about the property. Up close, the damage was worse than the photos suggested. The portico partially caved, 3 windows boarded, the porch sagging too badly to trust with my weight. But the bones were extraordinary. Hand-carved crown molding under the cracked plaster. Original leaded glass. A curved central staircase that took my breath away, even coated in 3 years of dust. I walked through every room that afternoon with a notepad and a headlamp, the way I'd walked through hundreds of estate properties before, cataloging damage, imagining what was salvageable. By the time I came back outside into the cooling October air, I had already made the decision no rational person makes with $312 in the bank. I was going to live in that house while I restored it, sell my restoration work out of it, and eventually turn the whole property into something new. The first month was exactly what I expected. Filthy, backbreaking, unglamorous. I hauled out truckloads of ruined furniture, evicted a family of raccoons from the pantry, and patched the roof myself with tarps because I couldn't afford a contractor. I slept in a sleeping bag in the one room with an intact ceiling and told myself every night that this had been the right decision. It was during the 5th week, while I was clearing out the library, a long, high-ceilinged room lined floor to ceiling with built-in mahogany bookshelves, that I first noticed something was wrong with the wall. I was testing the shelving for structural soundness the way I always do, knuckles against wood, listening for the particular hollow give of water-damaged framing. The shelves on the left side of the room sounded exactly the way old built-ins should. The shelves on the right sounded the same. But there was a section in the center, behind a run of shelving roughly 5 feet wide, that didn't sound hollow at all. It sounded solid, packed, in a way that had nothing to do with insulation or water damage. I told myself it was probably just a chimney chase, some structural element original to the 1928 construction. Old mansions were full of strange architectural quirks nobody bothered to explain. I told myself that for 4 more days. Then I bought a stud finder from the hardware store in town, ran it slowly across that section of shelving, and watched the display do something insulation has never once done in my 8 years of restoration work. It read solid, uniform density, straight through, broken only by a narrow seam running vertically along the left edge of the shelving unit, a seam shaped exactly like a door. I sat down on the dusty library floor and stared at that wall for a long time. Outside, the wind was moving through the oaks, and I could hear acorns hitting the porch roof in a slow, irregular rhythm. Some part of me, the same part that had known, somehow, not to trust Nora with the paperwork all those years ago, understood that whatever was behind that shelving was going to change something. And some part of me didn't want to know. But I went and got my pry bar anyway. The section of shelving came away from the wall easier than I expected, which told me it had been designed to. Behind it wasn't studs and insulation but a flat steel door, painted the same dark mahogany as the shelving to disguise it, set into what must have once been a servant's pass-through between the library and an adjoining study. The door wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. Nobody who wasn't already looking for it would have found the handle, recessed flush into the steel and nearly invisible under 3 coats of paint. I pulled it open, and the smell that came out was dry and metallic, like old coins and cedar shavings. The room behind it was small, maybe 9 feet by 7, with a poured concrete floor and a single bare bulb wired into the house's original electrical system, wired deliberately, decades ago, not as an afterthought. My headlamp caught the far wall, wooden crates stacked 3 high, stenciled with shipping codes I didn't recognize, and 6 metal lock boxes with hasps but no locks. I didn't touch anything that first night. I stood in the doorway with my heart pounding, made myself breathe, then finally opened the first lockbox, full of cash, banded stacks of hundreds wrapped in paper sleeves gone yellow at the edges. The second box held more cash. The third held something heavier, 6 gold bars, each stamped with a refinery mark I photographed with shaking hands. The crates held more of the same, packed in sawdust like they'd been midshipmen and never made it out. It was only after I'd worked through half the room that I saw the envelope. It sat alone on a narrow wooden shelf mounted at eye level on the right-hand wall, propped against the concrete like it had been placed there deliberately for whoever eventually found this room. Plain white, sealed with a blob of dark wax. No name on the front. Nothing at all except the seal itself. My hands were unsteady when I broke it open. Inside was a single index card, and on it, in handwriting that had gone brittle and faded but was still perfectly legible, was one word: leave. I sat down on the concrete floor with my back against the doorframe and stared at that word for what felt like a very long time. I want to tell you I understood immediately what it meant. I didn't. What I understood was that someone, Thomas Ashworth, presumably, though I had no way to confirm that yet, had built this room with enough foresight to leave a warning inside it, which meant he had known, at some point, that whatever was in here carried a risk serious enough to warn a stranger about. I didn't leave. I want to be honest about that, because in the weeks that followed I would ask myself why more times than I can count, and the answer never changed. Leaving requires knowing what you're leaving from. I didn't know anything yet. What I had was a hidden room full of money and gold in a mansion I had legally purchased for $400, a warning with no explanation attached to it, and no earthly idea who had left it or why. I didn't sleep that night. I pushed the shelving unit back into place as best I could, wedged a length of 2x4 against it, and sat at the folding table I'd set up in the kitchen with a mug of coffee I never drank, watching the windows go from black to gray to the flat white light of a November morning. What I knew about Thomas Ashworth by sunrise was almost nothing. He had died alone in this house in 2015. He had lived here for at least the previous 3 decades, according to county tax records I'd glanced at before the auction. He had no will, no known heirs, no next of kin the state's search had ever turned up. That was the entire sum of my knowledge about the man whose secret room I had just opened with a pry bar and a stud finder from the Belhaven hardware store. What I did the next morning was drive into town, not to the records office, not to a lawyer, but to the Belhaven Public Library. I wasn't ready to make anything official yet. I needed information before I made a move I couldn't take back. The reference librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth Aldis, pulled the microfilm archive of the Belhaven Gazette without asking why I wanted 40 years of back issues. I spent nearly 5 hours at that machine, scrolling through county board minutes, obituaries, and classified notices, looking for any mention of Thomas Ashworth's name. He appeared exactly twice. Once in 1987, in a brief item about a zoning variance granted to a company called Ashworth Trading Company for a parcel of land off Route 12, a company I'd never heard of registered, according to the notice, at this exact address. And once in a 2016 obituary for a man named Walter Pruitt, described as a longtime business associate of Thomas Ashworth of Belcross Lane, survived by a son, Victor, and a sister, Deborah. I wrote both names down. Walter Pruitt, Victor Pruitt, Deborah Pruitt. Underneath them, I wrote the name of the attorney listed as counsel of record on the 1987 zoning notice, Simon Reed, of Reed and Associates, out of the county seat in Lexington. I drove home as the light was fading, and the house looked different to me pulling up the long gravel drive than it had that morning. Not threatening, exactly. Watchful, like something that had been keeping a secret so long it had almost forgotten how to stop. The next day, I counted everything. It took the entire day, working alone at the folding table with the library door shut and locked behind me, stacking bills by denomination the way I'd once stacked inventory sheets for estate sales, counting each stack twice because I didn't trust my own hands not to be shaking too badly to get it right the first time. When I finally finished, the cash alone came to just over $2,750,000. The gold, based on a spot price I looked up on my phone with fingers that wouldn't quite stay still, was worth close to another $600,000. I sat at that table for a long time afterward, staring at numbers that didn't feel real no matter how many times I added them up. $3,400,000, give or take, sitting in a hidden room behind a bookshelf in a mansion I had bought for $400 from a dead man with no heirs anyone had ever found. The envelope's single word sat folded in my jacket pocket the entire time I counted, and I kept thinking about it. Leave. Someone had put that word there on purpose, which meant someone had understood, long before I ever showed up, that whoever eventually found this room might need to be warned. Which meant this money had a history, and in my experience, histories always have people still attached to them. I just didn't know yet how many, or how close. I knew I needed a lawyer, And I knew it couldn't be Simon Reed. He'd been connected to Ashworth Trading Company since at least 1987. I needed someone with no history in Belhaven County at all. I found her through a referral from a former client, Angela Voss, a Lexington lawyer who specialized in property disputes involving irregular or undocumented assets. I read that phrase 3 times. My situation was going to stretch even that definition. I called her from my truck, parked 2 blocks from the house, because by that point I'd started to feel, irrationally I told myself, that the mansion's walls could somehow hear me making plans against it. I told Angela everything. The auction, the $400, the hidden room, the cash, the gold, the envelope with a single word inside it. I talked for almost 25 minutes without stopping. When I finally ran out of things to say, there was a pause on the line. "Are you safe right now?" she asked. That wasn't the question I expected. "I think so," I said. "Okay. Don't move any of it. Don't tell anyone else. Come see me tomorrow morning." Angela Voss turned out to be a sharp, unhurried woman in her 50s with the specific calm of someone who has spent 2 decades not being surprised by anything a client tells her. She listened to the whole story again in her office, taking notes in a small, precise hand, and when I finished she leaned back and studied me for a moment before she spoke. "Here's what you need to understand going in," she said. "Your legal footing on the property itself is solid. You purchased it through a legitimate county tax auction, and under most state law, the contents of a structure you legally own generally belong to you as well. But if this money can be traced to criminal activity, that changes everything. The government can claim it. Any identifiable victims of whatever generated it can claim it. If it turns out to be money that was simply saved and hidden, even hidden strangely, it's almost certainly yours outright. The difference is going to come down to what we can prove, or fail to prove, about where it came from." She advised me to file a report with the Belhaven County Sheriff's Office immediately, not because the law strictly required it in this exact situation, but because an official, time-stamped record of the discovery was the single strongest protection available to me. "If anyone later claims you found this and tried to hide it," she said, "you want a clear record showing you went straight to the authorities the moment you had a plan for how to do it responsibly." I filed the report that same afternoon. The young deputy who took my statement made one phone call, then another, and within the hour I was sitting across from Sheriff Roy Callahan, a heavy-set man in his late 50s whose unhurried, watchful manner I found, against all odds, reassuring. He took it seriously, sent a deputy to the house with me that same day, photographed the room, logged serial numbers on the bills and the stamped marks on the gold, and sealed it under an evidence order. Then, standing in that concrete space, he said something that made the floor tilt under me. "You know what's strange?" he said, flipping back through an old file on his tablet. "We had a call about this address back in 2017. Anonymous tip said there might be a large amount of cash or valuables hidden somewhere on the property. We sent someone out, walked the house, found nothing. Closed it as unfounded." He looked up. "Looks like whoever called that in wasn't wrong. Just didn't know exactly where to look. Someone had called in a tip in 2017, 2 years after Thomas Ashworth died, 3 years before I ever set foot on the property, which meant someone had known, or at least strongly suspected, that this money existed, and had tried at some point to have it found and seized before I ever came along. That tip hadn't worked, and whoever made it had never stopped wondering where it had gone. I drove home with the windows down despite the cold, because I needed the air on my face to keep my head clear. I was still sitting in the driveway, engine off, staring at the dark shape of the house against the tree-line, when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "We know what you found. Don't do anything stupid." I photographed the screen, forwarded it to Angela, and called the sheriff's office before I'd even finished reading it a second time. My hands weren't steady when I set the phone down. Angela called back within 20 minutes. "That's a burner number," she said, "which tells us something useful. Whoever sent it prepared for this possibility in advance. This isn't a panicked reaction. This is someone who's been watching and waiting, with a plan already in place for if it ever came to this. The next morning, she called with news. She had a contact at the county recorder's office and had pulled the full corporate history of Ashworth Trading Company. 2 listed members from its founding, Thomas Ashworth and Walter Pruitt, the same Walter Pruitt whose obituary had called him Ashworth's longtime business associate. I finally had a name attached to a real, provable connection, and whoever had sent that text already knew I did too. Angela moved fast once we had a name to work with. Within 2 days, she'd filed an emergency motion asking the court to place the money and gold under supervised custody pending a formal ownership determination, and she'd simultaneously flagged the threatening text with the county prosecutor's office. The prosecutor, an assistant district attorney named Melissa Tran, was interested immediately. A burner phone threat sent to a woman who had just legally reported a multi-million-dollar discovery was not, in her words, a coincidence worth ignoring. I spent those first days at a motel just outside Lexington rather than at the house. Angela had suggested it plainly, without dressing it up, and I hadn't argued. I wasn't being brave. I was being careful, and there's a difference between the two that I was only just starting to understand. Angela's research on Walter Pruitt's side of the family moved quickly once the court order was in place. His son, Victor Pruitt, was 44, a commercial developer based out of Lexington with a portfolio of small retail properties and, buried in county civil records, a 2016 lawsuit from a former contractor alleging unpaid invoices, settled quietly out of court. He also, Angela discovered within the same week, had a personal attorney of record. His name was Simon Reed, the same Simon Reed who had represented Ashworth Trading Company back in 1987. The same name I had instinctively decided, on nothing more than a hunch in a library archive, not to call. My instincts, it turned out, had been right to be afraid. Angela laid out her working theory one afternoon in her office, a legal pad covered in arrows and names between us. "This is still a theory," she said, "so don't treat it as fact yet. But Ashworth and Pruitt ran something together for decades that generated large, consistent cash that couldn't easily be deposited or explained. When Walter Pruitt died in 2016, Victor would have expected his father's share. If Ashworth stonewalled him, Victor would have been stuck. You can't sue someone over money you can't legally explain having a claim to. So the anonymous tip in 2017, I said slowly, was very possibly Victor, hoping a police search would flush the money out into the open, after which he could try to insert himself as an interested party. It didn't work. The deputies never found the room. Ashworth must have sealed it well enough to survive a walkthrough. And then Ashworth died in 2019. The house sat in legal limbo for 3 years, and Victor was left waiting for a chance to either buy the property himself or get someone else to find what he couldn't. "And then I showed up," I said, "and paid $400 for it before he ever got the chance." She didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. That evening, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Angela had told me to record every contact, so I answered. The voice was smooth, unhurried. A man who'd rehearsed exactly what he meant to say. "Ms. Whitlock, my name is Victor Pruitt. I think it's time we talked." I said nothing. That money was built by my father's work alongside Thomas Ashworth. There was a private understanding between them that entitles my family to a share. I'm not asking for anything that isn't rightfully mine. I'm asking you to be reasonable. "Talk to my attorney," I said and hung up. I forwarded the recording to Angela, then sat on the edge of the motel bed and let myself shake for exactly 5 minutes, a rule I'd made for myself because I couldn't afford to let fear run longer than that. 5 minutes, then back to work. Angela called back within the hour. "He's going to escalate," she said. "He doesn't have a claim he can bring into open court without exposing what generated that money in the first place, which means whatever he tries next is going to happen outside a courtroom." Be ready for that. She was right within 3 days. I found the side servant's door forced open, the old lock broken with something blunt. Nothing valuable was missing. The sealed room was untouched under the evidence order, but my renovation notes had been gone through, and my folder of purchase documents left open on the kitchen table, pages out of order. Someone had been looking for something they needed to counter whatever claim I might have. I called the sheriff, called Angela, photographed everything, then drove to a diner on Route 12 for coffee because I needed somewhere quiet to think. What did Victor Pruitt need badly enough to break into a house under active police investigation? The answer came to me slowly, the way answers do when you're exhausted and frightened and sitting alone in a booth watching trucks pass on the highway outside. He needed to know whether some kind of written agreement existed, the private understanding he'd mentioned on the phone. If it existed and I had it, it could cut either way. It could support his claim to a share, or it could expose exactly what his father and Ashworth had actually been doing together for 30 years. I didn't have it, but now, for the first time, I knew to start looking. I gave myself 3 days after that, exactly as I'd promised myself I would whenever things got too heavy to think clearly through. I stayed at the motel. I slept in real increments instead of in fragments. I called my brother and let him talk to me about nothing in particular for 40 minutes. I watched 2 entire movies I don't remember anything about and let my body come down from whatever chemical state it had been running on for 2 straight weeks. When the 3 days were up, Victor Pruitt had gone completely quiet. No more calls. No more unknown numbers. No further sign of anyone at the house. Angela warned me not to mistake that silence for retreat. A man like this, advised by a lawyer like Simon Reed, doesn't stop pushing when the first approach doesn't work, she said. He goes quiet to recalculate. That's usually more dangerous than the noise, not less. I used the quiet. I went back to the house on a Monday morning with a legal pad and a completely different purpose than renovation. I wasn't fixing anything anymore. I was searching, methodically, room by room, in every place a man careful enough to build a hidden steel-doored room might also hide a piece of paper. I pulled up loose floorboards in the study. I checked behind every electrical plate on the second floor. I went through 3 generations of accumulated storage in the attic crawl space with a headlamp and increasingly numb fingers. I found it on a Thursday, tucked inside the hollowed-out pages of an old family Bible shoved into a steamer trunk against the attic's north wall, buried under decades of moth-eaten linens. 4 handwritten pages, dated 1985, signed at the bottom by both Thomas Ashworth and Walter Pruitt. It was a partnership agreement, and it was specific. The 2 men had operated what the document dryly referred to as a private cash consolidation arrangement, servicing a network of unlicensed card rooms and short-term lenders across 3 counties, absorbing untraceable cash and slowly reintroducing it into the legitimate economy through a rotation of shell entities, of which Ashworth Trading Company was one. The agreement laid out a clean 60-40 split in Ashworth's favor, and buried in the final paragraph was a single clause that stopped my breath entirely. In the event of either partner's death, the arrangement dissolved automatically, and any remaining assets reverted fully to the surviving partner, not to heirs, not to estates, not under any circumstance to the next generation. Walter Pruitt had died in 2016. Under this clause, his entire share had reverted to Thomas Ashworth that same year. When Ashworth died in 2019 with no surviving partner and no heir the state could locate, the arrangement simply had nowhere left to revert to. Victor Pruitt had no legal claim to a single dollar of it. He never had. I sat on the attic floor for a long time with the pages open across my knees, dust drifting slowly through the one shaft of afternoon light coming through the vent. Outside, I could hear a car passing on Belcross Lane, slowing, then continuing on. Relief and dread arrived together in the same breath because I understood immediately what I was holding wasn't just proof I could keep the money. It was a written, signed, decades-old confession to a criminal enterprise, and the prosecutor's office was going to want every page of it. I photographed every page of the agreement before I let myself move it, then called Angela from the attic floor with the pages still spread across my lap. She was quiet for a moment after I read it to her, which from a woman as unflappable as Angela Voss was its own kind of alarm. "Emma, this changes the picture substantially," she said finally. "It also means the prosecutor's office is going to be very interested in this document, and how they choose to use it is going to shape your claim as much as anything else does. There's a path here, and I want to be clear, nothing about it is guaranteed, where you cooperate fully with an investigation into what this agreement actually describes, and in exchange, your position as a good-faith purchaser of the property gets treated with real sympathy by the court deciding what happens to the money. And Victor Pruitt," she added, "has spent the last several weeks trying to recover funds he has zero legal right to from an enterprise his own father helped run. The prosecutor is going to want to talk to him just as badly as she wants to talk to us." Something in my chest loosened, slightly for the first time in weeks. Not triumph, it was far too early for that, and I knew it. Something closer to the specific, grounded calm that comes only after you've stopped simply reacting to a situation and started actively shaping what happens to it next. 2 days later, I sat across from Melissa Tran, the assistant district attorney handling the case. She was precise and unhurried, and asked better questions in 90 minutes than anyone else had asked me in 3 weeks. I gave her the partnership agreement, the photographs, the recording of Victor's call, the break-in documentation, and the threatening text. She thanked me and said an investigator would be in touch. Walking out into thin winter sunlight, I called Priya, an old friend from design school who'd been checking on me for weeks without pressing for details. "I need dinner with someone who's known my face longer than 3 weeks," I told her. "Tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. She drove up and we sat in a diner booth for almost 3 hours while I told her everything. Not because I needed legal advice, but because I needed one person who cared about me as a friend, not a witness, to know I was still standing. "You are the single most terrifyingly stubborn person I've ever met," she said. "I prefer methodical," I said, and she laughed hard enough that the next booth turned to look. It was the first time I'd laughed like that in over a month. They came to the house on a Saturday morning, 10 days after I'd handed the agreement to Melissa Tran. I had moved back into the mansion by then. The room's contents were formally under supervised custody, so there was no longer any strategic reason to stay away. Renovation had picked back up alongside everything else, because work was the only thing that reliably quieted my mind. The knock came just after 9. Through the sidelight, I saw 2 figures on the porch. A tall man in a well-cut coat I recognized from Angela's file, Victor Pruitt, and beside him, a woman in her 60s, rigid posture, an expression already arranged into something like sympathy. I opened the door but didn't step back to let them in. "Ms. Whitlock," Victor said. "I apologize for showing up unannounced. This is my aunt, Deborah Pruitt. She was very close to my father. We wanted to come speak with you directly. We feel there's been a serious misunderstanding here." Deborah gave me a carefully practiced look of sorrow. "My brother would be devastated to know things had turned so adversarial," she said. "He and Thomas Ashworth were partners for over 30 years. Friends, really." I said nothing. Silence, I had learned over the past month, carried more weight in conversations like this than anything I could say back. "The truth is," Victor continued, his voice modulated into something just short of reasonable, "my father put decades into that arrangement with Ashworth. A great deal of what's in that room exists because of his work, not Ashworth's alone." He spread his hands in a gesture meant to look like generosity. "I understand the legal picture is complicated, but surely you can see there's a moral obligation here that goes beyond a piece of paper." There it was. Moral. The word people reach for exactly when they've already been told, by someone who knows better, that they don't have a legal one. "We're not asking for everything," Deborah said, stepping slightly forward, as though she were offering me a great concession. "A quarter! That's genuinely all we'd ask for. A quiet, private arrangement between us. No more court filings, no more stress on either side. You keep the house, you keep the overwhelming majority of it. We all simply move forward." I looked at both of them for a long moment before I answered. "Do you know what I find genuinely strange about this offer?" I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. "You're standing on my porch, making it the same week your own attorney filed a motion trying to have the partnership agreement excluded from evidence entirely." Victor's carefully composed expression flickered, just barely, for half a second. "Those are two separate matters," he said. "They're not, though," I said. "If you genuinely believed you had a moral claim to any of this, you'd be making it in open court. You're standing here instead because you've already been told you can't win it there. And I'm not interested in a private arrangement designed to accomplish quietly what your legal strategy already can't accomplish in daylight." Deborah's sympathetic expression curdled into something considerably sharper. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice dropping. "Victor has relationships in this county that go back generations. People who've known this family for a very long time. You're a stranger here, and strangers who make enemies of the wrong people in a small county don't always find that county quite as welcoming afterward." "Deborah," Victor said quickly, but it was already too late. The mask had slipped, and all three of us knew it. "I think you should both leave," I said. Victor looked at me for a long moment with an expression that wasn't quite anger, something colder underneath it, something that had been sitting there the whole time politeness was doing its work. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked back down the porch steps with Deborah trailing behind him. Their car pulled out of the gravel drive a moment later, tires kicking up dust that hung in the cold morning air long after they were gone. I called Angela the second I closed the door and repeated Deborah's last line back to her. There was a pause, then, to my surprise, something almost like satisfaction in her voice. "That's very good for us. An implied threat on your doorstep, on top of everything else in the file, tells a prosecutor exactly what kind of family this is. Not one with a legitimate claim they haven't been able to prove. One that's been applying pressure to someone standing between them and something they want." I stood at the kitchen window for a long time after we hung up, watching the ivy move against the east wall. The house looked, for the first time since I bought it, less like something waiting and more like something slowly becoming mine. "How much longer?" I asked that evening. "Weeks, not months," Angela said. "We're close now." The hearing was set for a Thursday in mid-December, 6 weeks after Melissa Tran's investigation had formally opened. Angela had been told, in the vague language prosecutors use, that it had been productive. What that meant in practice, I found out in stages, sitting in the hearing room in a second-hand charcoal blazer, hands folded in my lap, trying to hold on to the calm I'd worked so hard to find. What I knew walking in, Melissa Tran had filed a criminal referral against Victor for harassment and witness intimidation built on the text, the call, and Deborah's statement on my porch. Simon Reed's motion to exclude the partnership agreement had been denied outright, and a forensic accountant had spent 4 weeks tracing serial numbers on the cash and refinery stamps on the gold against decades of banking and pawnshop records pulled under subpoena. Some of it traced to entirely ordinary transactions, decades old and unremarkable. Some traced to what the report described, in flat official language, as proceeds consistent with unlicensed lending and gambling operations spanning multiple jurisdictions. Some of that money was clean enough to stand on its own. Some of it very clearly wasn't. Victor Pruitt sat across the room beside Simon Reed, dressed impeccably, his expression arranged into the patient, faintly wounded look of a man waiting for an obvious misunderstanding to resolve itself in his favor. I had seen that particular expression before on other people in other rooms. It was a kind of armor, and it was very good armor right up until it wasn't. Melissa Tran walked the judge through the entire timeline with methodical precision. The auction, the discovery, the report I'd filed the same afternoon, the threatening text, the break-in, the discovery of the 1985 partnership agreement, the visit from Victor and Deborah Pruitt at my front door. Then she introduced the forensic accountant's full findings. Then she introduced something Angela hadn't told me was coming. She called a witness. Earl Whitman, 74, a retired hardware store owner from outside Belhaven, who under limited immunity described his first-hand involvement with the cash operation Ashworth and Pruitt had run for 3 decades. He named Walter Pruitt as his direct contact for most of that time. He named Simon Reed as the attorney who'd personally drawn up the shell company paperwork. Simon Reed, at the defense table, went very still. Victor leaned toward him and said something low I couldn't hear. Reed shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Then Melissa Tran continued, "Your Honor, at this time the state would also like to enter into the record that a second cooperating witness, under a separate immunity agreement, has corroborated Mr. Whitman's testimony and additionally provided documentation showing that Victor Pruitt was personally aware of the nature of this operation no later than 2013, and that he received a direct cash distribution from it that same year in the amount of $50,000. Victor's composure didn't shatter outright, but something behind it did, visibly, in a way I could actually watch happen across the room, a shift from controlled stillness to something closer to frozen. Simon Reed put a hand briefly on his arm. The judge asked Reed if his client wished to respond. Reed stood. "Your Honor, my client categorically denies." "Mr. Reed," the judge said, cutting him off, "I'm going to stop you there. Given what we've just heard, I'm also directing that the State Bar's Ethics Committee be notified regarding a potential conflict of interest arising from your firm's role in originally structuring these entities and your current representation of Mr. Pruitt in matters directly related to them. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor." Reed sat down. I watched Victor Pruitt across the room. He was staring straight ahead now, jaw tight, eyes fixed on some point on the far wall. The armor was still technically in place, but we could all see, plainly, the dents underneath it. The months that followed moved at the law's particular, relentless pace. Simon Reed withdrew from Victor's case within the week, citing conflict of interest. 2 weeks later, the State Bar opened a formal investigation into his firm's role in structuring the shell companies. Victor hired new counsel out of Louisville, who began quietly exploring a plea within 10 days. There was no real deal to be had. The case moved forward on 2 charges, witness intimidation and criminal receipt of proceeds from an illegal enterprise tied to the $50,000 distribution from 2013. Earl Whitman's testimony held under cross-examination. The second cooperating witness held as well. Victor's attorney argued he hadn't understood his father's business. The paperwork, combined with Earl's testimony that he'd met Victor at 2 operational meetings, made that argument almost impossible to sustain. In March, Victor Pruitt pleaded guilty to 1 count of criminal receipt of proceeds from an illegal enterprise. He was fined $175,000 and sentenced to 18 months of supervised release. He didn't go to prison. That part was hard to sit with at first, the sense the consequence didn't fully match what he'd put me through. Angela reminded me that a public conviction wasn't nothing for a man who'd built his livelihood on being trusted with other people's money. It meant a permanent record, professional damage, and the loss of the exact reputation that had been his most valuable asset. The civil proceeding over the money resolved in early May. The portion traced conclusively to illegal sources, roughly $850,000 in cash and 2 of the 6 gold bars, was forfeited to the state. The remainder, which the accountant couldn't connect to any specific illegal proceeds, was determined to belong to me outright as the lawful purchaser of the property and everything found inside it. That remainder came to just over $1.9 million in cash, plus 4 gold bars worth roughly $400,000 at the time of the ruling. I sat in my truck in the courthouse lot for a long time after Angela called with the news, saying something incoherent that made her laugh out loud. "You earned every dollar of that," she said. It was early May, the oak outside her office in full leaf, and I sat there watching the light move through it, thinking, for the first time in months, that I might actually be through the worst of it. Deborah Pruitt was interviewed once by investigators and declined to cooperate further than she legally had to. She was never charged. What she'd said on my porch was serious, but on its own it didn't rise to a prosecutable threat. Still, I'd made a written, time-stamped note of her exact words within the hour, and it sat in the case file as part of a larger pattern the court had already seen. What happened to Deborah after that was entirely her own business. Victor's development portfolio, I learned later, had been leveraged more heavily than anyone outside his accountant realized, and most of that leverage depended on a clean record. The conviction started a slow, predictable collapse. 2 lenders called in outstanding notes within months. A retail project lost its anchor tenant, spooked by the headlines. By winter, his company had filed for dissolution. None of that was anything I did directly. It was simply the arithmetic of what he'd chosen to do, finally catching up with him. I took no particular satisfaction in it, only a quiet acknowledgement that consequences, once moving, rarely stop at the ones a courtroom formally hands down. I finished the full restoration the following October, almost exactly a year after I'd first knocked my knuckles against that library shelving and heard something that didn't sound right. I'd planned from the beginning to flip it and move on with whatever profit I made. That had been the entire plan. But somewhere in those 12 months, the raccoons, the roof tarps, the library floor I'd sat on twice with my whole life balanced on one decision, the house had stopped being a project and become something else. Mine, in the intimate way you only know something you've taken apart with your own hands and put carefully back together. The library wall showed no trace of what had once been behind it. I'd had the shelving rebuilt exactly as it was, mahogany matched board for board, because I liked knowing the house still held that story even if nobody looking at it could tell. The hidden room itself I left mostly as it was, minus its contents. I turned it into a small climate-controlled space for the antique pieces I restore now, which I find, in a way I don't fully examine too closely, quietly satisfying every time I walk past it. With the settlement, I set up a real operating fund for the restoration business I rebuilt from scratch. Whitlock Restorations. No partners this time, no shared name on the paperwork. Within a year I had 6 regular clients. Within 2, 19, including 2 historical societies that now send me pieces from across the region. I paid off my mother's remaining mortgage, something I'd been quietly wanting to do for almost a decade and had never once had the means to attempt. She cried on the phone when I told her. I did too, sitting alone in the newly finished kitchen with the gold-veined marble counters I'd salvaged from an estate sale 2 towns over. My brother, who had once sent me retail management job listings with careful, worried subject lines, took me to dinner and told me he'd never once doubted it would work out. I let him believe that because it was kinder than the truth, and because by then it didn't matter anymore. Priya, who had driven up from Asheville to sit with me in a diner booth for 3 hours and tell me I was the most terrifyingly stubborn person she knew, became one of my very first paying clients. The restoration I did on her grandmother's dining set ended up photographed for a regional design magazine. It was my first real press coverage in the new business, and I kept the clipping pinned above my workbench for months. I thought about Nora Bellamy sometimes in the months that followed, not with the sharp, corrosive anger I'd carried for most of that first year after she dissolved our partnership without telling me, but with something closer to a distant, almost clinical curiosity. She'd taken the client list and the vendor relationships and the years we'd built together and turned them into something new under her own name. From what little I could see from the outside, a modest website, an Instagram page that hadn't posted in a while, an occasional mention in a regional trade newsletter. It seemed to be going adequately. Not badly. Not particularly well either. Just adequately. I didn't wish her any specific harm. I also, if I'm being fully honest, didn't wish her much of anything at all anymore. She'd become a closed chapter, filed and put away, the kind of thing I was aware of only once in a great while, and mostly not. Simon Reed's law license was suspended for 2 years, pending a full review of his firm's decades-long involvement in structuring the shell entities described in the 1985 agreement. Whether he'd ever practice again after that, I honestly never found out, and by that point I'd stopped particularly caring to check. Angela Voss sent a bottle of good champagne to the house the week the final civil determination came through, with a small card that read simply, "Well done." I still have that card. It's tucked into the frame of a mirror in my front hallway, where I see it every single time I walk through the door. The mansion on Belcross Lane, that following October, looked almost exactly the way it had the very first afternoon I drove out to see it, except now the portico columns stood straight and freshly painted. The windows were clear glass instead of plywood, the ivy had been cut back to a single tidy line along the east wall, and there was warm light in nearly every window after dark. I sat on the front steps one evening that fall with a glass of wine, watching the oaks along the drive turn that same deep rust color they'd been the day I first saw the place, and I thought about what it actually means to start over. Not the easy version people like to imagine, the clean break, the fresh page, the idea that you simply set the hard thing down and walk forward unburdened. The real version is heavier than that. It's cumulative. It carries every bit of what came before it, and it's shaped by that weight in ways that make it stronger, not weaker, even when the shaping itself hurt. I bought a falling-down mansion for $400. I found more money behind a library wall than I will likely ever fully process. I was threatened, broken into, lied to, and pressured by people who had more money and more standing in that county than I ever will. And I am still here, still in this house, still building something with my own 2 hands out of what other people walked away from. The oaks still had most of their leaves that evening, burning that same deep orange red in the last of the light. I stayed out on the steps until the cold finally drove me inside, and then I went in, and I locked the door behind me, and for the first time in over a year, that felt like exactly what it was, just an ordinary door, in an ordinary house that happened to be entirely mine. Thomas Ashworth left one word behind for whoever eventually found what he'd hidden. Leave. I think, now, he meant something bigger than the single word on the card. I think he meant, don't let what trapped me end up trapping you too. I didn't leave, but I also didn't let fear make a single one of my decisions for me. I documented everything. I trusted the right people, slowly, one at a time. I took it one step at a time, even when every part of me wanted to either run or freeze completely. That's really the whole lesson, if there is one. Not bravery, exactly. Just a stubborn, methodical refusal to be pushed around by people who assumed I wouldn't fight for what was legally mine. So tell me, what would you have done? A hidden room, a single warning, a man on your porch offering you a reasonable deal for something that was never his to begin with? Run. Report it. Fight for it. Tell me in the comments. If this story stayed with you, make sure you're subscribed to Kate's Fortune Stories. There's a new one waiting for you every week. And trust me, some of them go even further than this one did. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next story.